Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Echoes in the static. The first rule of lighthouse keeping is to maintain the light. The second rule is to never trust what you see in the fog. I wish someone had warned me about the third rule: never answer the radio when it calls after midnight. My name is Thomas Blackwood. I've been the keeper at Widow's Point Lighthouse for 3 years now, a job I took after 20 years in the Coast Guard. I thought it would be a peaceful retirement of sorts, just me, the gulls, and the rhythmic wash of waves against the rocky Maine coastline. The lighthouse itself is a relic, one of the few still manned in this age of automation. The Oceanic Safety Authority keeps it staffed mainly for historical purposes, and because the strange geography of the bay creates unusual weather patterns that sometimes confuse the automated systems. The lighthouse stands on a granite outcropping that juts into the Atlantic like a gnarled finger. Behind it, dense pine forests crawl up the coastal mountains, and the nearest town, Havensport, is 12 miles south. The isolation never bothered me. After a divorce and a daughter who moved across the country, solitude felt like a gift. I arrived in October 2019, just before winter set in. The previous keeper, an old man named Gerald Finch, seemed eager to leave. As he handed me the keys, his weathered hand trembled slightly. "Keep the light on no matter what," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "And don't believe everything you hear on that radio." I laughed, thinking it was just the rambling of an old sailor, the kind of superstitious nonsense that clings to coastal communities like barnacles. Gerald didn't laugh with me. He just nodded as if he'd done his duty by warning me, and drove away in his rusted pickup truck. The lighthouse itself is a 3-story stone tower with attached living quarters. The ground floor houses the generator room, storage, and a small workshop. The second floor contains my living space, a kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom. The third floor holds the watch room with its wraparound windows and the radio equipment. Above that is the lantern room with its massive Fresnel lens, still functioning after nearly 150 years. My duties were simple: maintain the light in buildings, monitor weather conditions, and report any vessels in distress. The radio system was modern enough, a standard marine VHF setup that connected me to the Coast Guard, other lighthouses, and passing ships. There was also an older shortwave radio that Gerald had kept just in case, though in case of what, he never specified. The first 2 winters passed uneventfully. I fell into a comfortable routine. During the day, I'd perform maintenance, log weather data, and occasionally chat with passing fishing boats. At night, I'd read, listen to music, or watch DVDs on my small television. The internet connection was spotty at best, non-existent during storms, so I'd amassed quite a library of books and films. It was during my 3rd winter, this past January, when things changed. A particularly vicious nor'easter had been battering the coast for 3 days. The wind howled around the tower like a living thing, and waves crashed against the rocks with enough force to send spray past the second-floor windows. The power had gone out twice, forcing me to run the backup generator. On the 3rd night of the storm, I was in the watch room, scanning the horizon with binoculars, though visibility was near zero in the driving snow. The radio had been quiet all day except for weather updates and the occasional check-in from Coast Guard Station Havensport. At precisely 11:47 p.m., I remember checking my watch. The shortwave radio crackled to life. At first, I thought it was just static, the storm interfering with the equipment, but then I heard a voice faint beneath the white noise. "Assistance, position, 47 north, 68 west." I adjusted the dial, trying to clear the signal. The voice grew slightly stronger, though still wrapped in static. "This is the merchant vessel Windward. Request immediate assistance, taking on water. Position 47 degrees north, 68 degrees west." I grabbed my logbook and noted the time and message, then checked the coordinates on my chart. The position was about 15 miles offshore, directly east of the lighthouse. I reached for the Coast Guard frequency. "Coast Guard Station Havensport, this is Widow's Point Lighthouse. I've received a distress call from merchant vessel Windward, position 47 north, 68 west, taking on water. Over." After a moment, the response came through. "Widow's Point, this is Havensport. We have no vessel with that designation on our registry. Are you certain of the name?" Over. Affirmative, Havensport, the vessel identified as Windward. I'll attempt to re-establish contact for confirmation. Over. I switched back to the frequency where I'd heard the distress call. "Vessel Windward, this is Widow's Point Lighthouse. Please confirm your status and position." Over. Nothing but static answered me. I tried again several times but couldn't re-establish contact. I reported back to Havensport, and they promised to check with other stations and commercial shipping registries. An hour later, they radioed back. "Widow's Point, we have no record of any vessel named Windward currently at sea in the North Atlantic. The last registered ship with that name was a cargo vessel that sank in 1957. Are you sure you heard correctly? Over, a cold feeling settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with the drafty watch room. Copy that, Havensport. Must have been interference or misheard. I'll maintain watch. Over, I spent the rest of the night scanning the horizon with binoculars, seeing nothing but the occasional glimpse of churning waves when the snow let up momentarily. By morning, the storm had begun to abate, and I convinced myself I'd either misheard the name or picked up some ham radio operator playing a prank. But that night at exactly the same time, 11:47 p.m., the shortwave crackled again. Windward to any receiving station, taking on water, heavy list to port. This time the voice was clearer, a man's voice, tense but controlled. Professional, the kind of voice I'd heard countless times in the Coast Guard from captains facing emergency situations. Vessel Windward, this is Widow's Point Lighthouse. I received your transmission. What is your current situation? Over, Widow's Point. Thank God, we're approximately 15 miles east of your position. Engine room flooded, storm damage to hull, request immediate assistance. I grabbed the VHF to alert the Coast Guard, but before I could transmit, the shortwave came alive again. They're in the hold, oh Christ, they're in the hold. Not supposed to be here, not supposed to. The voice had changed, becoming higher, panicked. In the background, I could hear what sounded like metal groaning, water rushing, and most disturbingly, what might have been screams. Windward, please clarify, who is in the hold? Are you under attack? Over. The only response was a burst of static, then silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. I immediately contacted Havensport and reported the transmission. They were skeptical but said they'd dispatch a cutter at first light if the weather permitted. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the radio on, scanning frequencies, but heard nothing more from the mysterious vessel. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a steel gray sky and a restless sea. The Coast Guard cutter found nothing at the coordinates, no debris, no oil slick, no sign that any vessel had been in distress. When they radioed me with their report, I could hear the doubt in the officer's voice. He didn't say it, but the implication was clear. They thought I was imagining things, or worse, making false reports. I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't heard it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. That evening, I pulled out the lighthouse's archives, dusty logbooks dating back decades, stored in a cedar chest in the workshop. I searched for any mention of the Windward. It took hours, but finally, in a logbook from 1957, I found it. January 17, 1957, 23:40 hours. Received distress call from MV Windward, position approximately 15 miles east. Reported taking on water during storm. Alerted Coast Guard. No further contact established. January 18, 1957, 800 hours. Coast Guard reports no sign of Windward. Search continuing. January 20, 1957, 16:00 hours. Search for Windward officially suspended. Presumed lost with all hands, crew of 12. I sat back, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead despite the chill in the room. The date of the sinking was January 17, exactly 65 years before I received the first transmission. And the time noted in the log, 23:40 hours, was 11:40 p.m., just minutes before I heard the call. I told myself it was a coincidence. Perhaps I'd read about the Windward somewhere and forgotten, and my mind had dredged up the name during a moment of storm-induced stress. Or maybe someone was playing an elaborate hoax, though I couldn't imagine who or why. The next night was clear, stars scattered across the black velvet sky like diamonds. I found myself dreading the approach of midnight. At 11:30, I made a fresh pot of coffee and took up position in the watch room, eyes fixed on the shortwave radio. 11:47 p.m. came and went in silence. I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment, which I recognized as irrational. At 12:30 a.m., convinced the phenomenon wouldn't repeat, I headed downstairs to bed. I had just drifted off to sleep when the bedside clock radio, a simple AM/FM model I used as an alarm, burst into static so loud I nearly fell out of bed. Through the noise came the now familiar voice. They're coming up from the hold, not human. Oh God, their faces. I scrambled for the radio, but as soon as my fingers touched it, the static ceased, replaced by the normal midnight programming, a talk show about conspiracy theories, ironically enough. I sat there, heart pounding, wondering if I dreamed it. The next morning, I called my doctor in Havensport and arranged for a checkup, concerned I might be experiencing auditory hallucinations. The earliest appointment was in 3 days, so I resolved to document everything meticulously until then. That night, I set up a digital recorder next to both the shortwave in the watch room and my clock radio. At 11:47, nothing happened on the shortwave, but at 3:33 a.m., I later checked the timestamp on the recording. Both devices captured the same transmission, .. Captain's log, final entry. Whatever we pulled up in the nets was not meant to be found. It looked like a statue, some kind of idol, but it's changing. And so is the crew. Harkins locked himself in the freezer after his skin started moving. First Mate Collins jumped overboard an hour ago. His face wasn't his anymore. I've locked myself in the radio room, but I can hear them scratching at the door. They want me to see the join. God help us, we should have left it in the deep. The recording was clear, too clear for a transmission from a sinking ship in 1957. When I played it back the next morning, I could hear details I'd missed. The sound of water sloshing against bulkheads, the creak of metal under stress, and underneath it all, a strange rhythmic sound like chanting in a language I couldn't identify. I took the recording to the Coast Guard station personally that day. The commander, a woman named Reyes who'd been friendly during our previous radio contacts, listened to it with increasing concern. "This is unsettling, Mr. Blackwood," she said when it finished, "but I'm not sure what you expect us to do. There's no vessel in distress, at least not now." "I know how it sounds," I said, "but something is happening. That ship, the Windward, it sank 65 years ago this week. What if somehow they're still out there, still sinking, still dying?" Commander Reyes gave me a look that mixed concern with pity. "Thomas, I'm going to be straight with you. Isolation can do strange things to the mind. I've seen it before with lighthouse keepers, solo sailors. Maybe it's time for a break." "I'm not imagining this," I insisted, pushing the recorder toward her. "It's right here." She pressed play. The recorder emitted nothing but white noise. My blood ran cold. I'd checked it before leaving the lighthouse. The recording had been perfect. "I'm sorry," I said, standing abruptly. "There must be something wrong with the device. I'll try again tonight." "Thomas," Commander Reyes said gently, "I'm concerned about you. Why don't you let us send someone to relieve you for a few weeks? Get some rest, see your daughter maybe." "I don't need relief," I said, more sharply than I intended. "I need someone to believe me." That night I set up multiple recording devices, my phone, my digital camera in video mode, the original recorder after checking it thoroughly. I placed them around the lighthouse, in the watch room, my bedroom, even the kitchen. At 11:47 p.m. all remained silent. At 3:33 a.m. nothing. I began to think that perhaps Commander Reyes was right, that isolation was affecting me more than I realized. Then, at 5:17 a.m., as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern horizon, every electronic device in the lighthouse activated simultaneously. The shortwave in my clock radio burst into static. My phone, though not connected to any network, began playing what sounded like a distorted Mayday call. Even the small television in my bedroom turned itself on, showing only snow, but with voices clearly audible beneath the visual chaos. Different voices now, not just the captain, a cacophony of pleas, warnings, and screams. Some seemed to be from the Windward's crew, but others mentioned different ships, different years. I caught fragments. SS Portland 1898 were breaking apart. Fishing vessel Northern Star 1973, something's in the water with us. Yacht Meridian 2012, they're coming aboard, their bodies all wrong. I stood frozen in the center of my bedroom as the voices washed over me from all directions. Then cutting through them all, a single voice, louder and clearer. "They never stop sinking, they never stop dying. The deep has claimed them, but it lets them call out. It feeds on the terror. And now it's heard you answering." The voice was Gerald Finch's, my predecessor at the lighthouse. As suddenly as it had started, the phenomenon ceased. Every device shut off simultaneously, leaving me in silence broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant sound of waves. I spent the day in a daze, checking and rechecking my recording devices. None had captured anything. According to them, there had been no electronic activity at 5:17 a.m. I began to seriously question my sanity. That afternoon, I drove into Havensport to keep my doctor's appointment. After describing my experiences, though carefully framing them as possible hallucinations rather than actual events, he prescribed a mild sedative and recommended a psychiatric evaluation in Portland. He suggested stress and isolation were likely culprits but ordered blood work to rule out physical causes. I filled the prescription but didn't take any pills. I needed to be alert, to document what was happening. If I couldn't trust electronic devices, I would rely on the oldest method, handwritten notes, timed and dated. That night I prepared differently. I turned off and unplugged every electronic device in the lighthouse except for the main beacon, which operated on a separate system. I took out a fresh notebook and a pen, and I waited in the watchroom with only a battery-powered lantern for light. At 11:47 p.m., the shortwave radio, despite being unplugged, came to life. But instead of static or distress calls, it emitted a series of tones, like an old dial-up modem or a fax machine. I dutifully noted this in my journal, including the exact time and duration, precisely 3 minutes. When it stopped, I approached the radio cautiously. The power cord still lay on the floor where I'd left it. I touched the radio. It was ice cold, much colder than the ambient temperature of the room. I returned to my chair and continued my vigil. At 3:33 a.m., nothing happened. At 5:17 a.m., nothing. I began to think that perhaps by disconnecting the electronics, I'd somehow disrupted the pattern. Then at 6:21 a.m., as the sun crested the horizon, sending golden light streaming through the watchroom windows, I heard footsteps on the spiral staircase leading up from the living quarters. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The tread of sea boots on metal steps. I stood, my heart hammering. "Who's there?" I called, though I knew I was alone in the lighthouse. The footsteps continued, unhurried, drawing closer. Water dripped audibly with each step, as if whoever approached was soaking wet. I backed against the windows, the notebook clutched to my chest like a shield. The footsteps reached the landing just outside the watchroom door. The doorknob turned slowly. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the door remained closed. The footsteps had stopped. But on the floor, leading from the door to the shortwave radio, was a trail of wet footprints. Not the prints of my boots, but larger ones, made by the sort of heavy work boots sailors wore decades ago. And the water that formed them wasn't clear. It was dark, almost black in the morning light, with the unmistakable smell of seawater and something else, something organic and rotting. I approached the radio, following the wet trail. The prints ended directly in front of it, as if someone had stood there, operating the controls. On the floor beside it lay a small object that hadn't been there before, a carved figurine, about 6 inches tall. It appeared to be made of some dark stone, slick and glossy even where it wasn't wet. It depicted a vaguely humanoid figure with an elongated head, too many limbs arranged in impossible configurations, and where its face should be, only a suggestion of writhing tentacles. Looking at it made my eyes hurt and my stomach churn. I didn't touch it. I backed away, then ran down the stairs to the living quarters, grabbed my coat and car keys, and fled the lighthouse. I drove straight to the Coast Guard station, the notebook still clutched in my hand. I must have looked half-mad, unshaven, wild-eyed, babbling about footprints and figurines and radios that worked without power. Commander Reyes listened more patiently than I deserved, then had one of her officers drive me back to the lighthouse. Chief Petty Officer Davis was a kind man in his 50s who chatted about fishing and baseball on the drive, clearly trying to keep me calm. When we arrived, I hesitated before unlocking the door. "The footprints will still be there," I told Davis, "and that thing, that idol or whatever it is. Let's take a look," he said neutrally. We climbed the stairs to the watchroom. The floor was dry. There was no figurine by the radio. The shortwave itself was where I'd left it, unplugged. "Mr. Blackwood," Davis said gently, "maybe you should consider taking some leave. This post can get to people, especially in winter." I nodded numbly. There seemed no point in arguing. After Davis left, promising to check on me the next day, I sat in the kitchen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind, or was something truly supernatural occurring? And if so, why? What did it want from me? I decided to take one of the sedatives the doctor had prescribed. I needed sleep, real sleep, not the fitful dozing I'd managed over the past few days. Perhaps with a clear head I could better assess the situation. I slept deeply and dreamlessly, waking only when my phone chimed with a text message. It was from Commander Reyes, "Checking on you. Davis will stop by this afternoon." I texted back that I was fine, just tired, and would welcome the company. Then I noticed the time, 2:17 p.m. I'd slept for nearly 18 hours. I made coffee and toast, feeling more clear-headed than I had in days. In daylight, with food in my stomach and caffeine in my system, the events of the past week seemed less terrifying, more like the product of an overtired mind and too many late nights alone. I decided to tackle the day's maintenance tasks to establish some normalcy. I checked the beacon, cleaned the lantern room windows, and was just about to test the foghorn when my phone rang. The screen showed unknown caller. "Hello," I answered. Static filled my ear, then a voice, faint but recognizable, "Gerald Finch." "Thomas, listen carefully, I don't have long. They can only reach through when conditions are right, when the veil is thin." "Gerald, what's happening? Who are they? The lost ones, the taken ones, the ships that went down with all hands." "There's something out there, Thomas, something old that lives in the deep. It doesn't just take ships and men, it takes their souls, their essence, keeps them in a kind of half-life, forever drowning, forever terrified. And it feeds on that terror." "The idol," I said, my mouth dry. "I saw it. So it's already manifesting physically. That's bad, Thomas, very bad. It means the boundary is weaker than I thought. Listen, they're trying to come through. Not just communicate, but cross over. And they need an anchor, someone who responds, who acknowledges them." "Me," I whispered. "Yes, by answering the radio, by recording them, by believing in them, you've created a connection. A doorway, and now they want to open it fully. How do I stop it? You have to break the connection, deny them. The next time they call, and they will call, tell them they're not real. Tell them they're dead and gone. Reject them completely. The line began to break up, static overwhelming his voice. Gerald, wait, how do you know all this? How? Because I answered too, came his voice, suddenly crystal clear. And now I'm with them, forever sinking. Forever drowning. Don't let them take you too, Thomas, don't. The call ended abruptly. I tried calling back, but got an automated message saying the number was not in service. With shaking hands, I searched online for information about Gerald Finch. According to the Havensport local news archives, Gerald had retired as lighthouse keeper and moved to Florida 3 years ago, shortly before I took the position. But the last article mentioning him was a small obituary dated 6 months after his retirement. Gerald Finch had drowned while fishing alone off the Florida coast. His body was never recovered. I sat heavily in my chair, the phone slipping from my numb fingers. If Gerald was dead, who or what had I just spoken to? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Chief Petty Officer Davis visited as promised, and I managed to present a calm, rational facade. Yes, I was feeling much better. Yes, the medication was helping. No more strange radio transmissions or footprints, just stress and isolation playing tricks on my mind. After he left, I paced the lighthouse, trying to decide what to do. I could leave, just pack up and drive away. But what if Gerald was right? What if I'd already established a connection that would follow me? And more pragmatically, I had nowhere to go. This lighthouse was my home now. As night fell, I made my decision. I would confront whatever was trying to come through. I would follow Gerald's advice and reject it, deny it entry. I would break the connection. I turned on every light in the lighthouse, as if brightness could somehow ward off the encroaching darkness. I placed the shortwave radio in the center of the watchroom floor and sat facing it, waiting. 11:47 p.m. arrived. The radio remained silent. 3:33 a.m., nothing. 5:17 a.m., still nothing. I began to hope that perhaps the connection was already broken, that whatever had been reaching out had given up. Then at 6:21 a.m., just as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the radio switched on by itself. But instead of static or voices, it emitted a sound like rushing water, growing louder and louder until it seemed to fill the room. The air around the radio began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The shimmering intensified, coalescing into a roughly human-shaped distortion. Water began to pour from this distortion, not onto the floor but into it, as if the solid wood had become permeable. Within the watery silhouette, I could make out features forming, the suggestion of a face, shoulders, arms. It was like watching a photograph develop, details emerging gradually from formlessness. I recognized the face taking shape. It was the same one I'd seen in Gerald Finch's obituary photo. "Gerald," I said, my voice barely audible over the sound of rushing water. The figure became more solid, more present. Gerald Finch stood before me, but not as I remembered him. His skin was pallid and bloated, his eyes milky white. Seawater dripped constantly from his clothes and hair, yet the floor beneath him remained dry, the water seeming to sink into the wood as it fell. "Thomas," he said, his voice gurgling as if his lungs were filled with liquid. "They're coming. I couldn't stop them. I tried to warn you, but I'm part of them now. We're all part of it." "What is it, Gerald?" "What's out there? Something ancient, something that was old when the first humans built rafts and dared the sea. It sleeps in the deep, but it dreams of terror and drowning and souls caught between life and death. And sometimes it reaches out through those it's taken, using them as lures, as bait." Behind Gerald, the air shimmered more intensely. More figures were taking shape, men in clothing from different eras, all bearing the marks of drowning. And behind them, something larger was forming, something that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "You have to reject us, Thomas," Gerald pleaded. "All of us, deny us entry. It's your only chance." I stood, facing the growing crowd of drowned men and the shadowy presence looming behind them. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking. "You're dead, gone. This is my lighthouse, my reality. You have no place here." The figures wavered like reflections in disturbed water. The rushing sound intensified. "You're dead," I shouted. "Lost at sea. You don't exist anymore." Gerald's form began to dissipate, breaking apart like fog in strong wind. "It's working," he said, his voice fading. "Keep going, deny it completely." The other figures were also losing definition, becoming translucent, but the presence behind them seemed to be growing more solid, more defined. I caught glimpses of something massive, with too many limbs and eyes like black pits. "You're not welcome here," I screamed at the manifesting horror. "Return to the deep, return to death." "You are not real." A sound like 1,000 drowning men gasping for air filled the room. The figures of the drowned sailors scattered like smoke, but the larger presence remained, now almost fully materialized. It was vaguely humanoid but wrong in fundamental ways, proportions impossible, limbs too numerous and jointed in places limbs shouldn't bend. Its skin glistened like wet obsidian, and where its face should be was a writhing mass of tentacles surrounding a vertical slit of a mouth. It was the entity depicted in the small idol I'd seen, but enormous, filling half the watch room, its upper portion seeming to phase through the ceiling. And it was reaching for me with limbs that bent and twisted in impossible ways. In that moment I understood. Gerald had been wrong. The drowned men weren't the threat, they were trying to warn me. The entity had used them as a conduit, weakening the boundary between its reality and mine. By rejecting them, I'd removed the last barrier to its entry. I backed away until I hit the windows. The thing advanced, moving in a way that suggested it wasn't fully bound by physical laws. Its tentacled face pulsed and writhed, the vertical mouth opening to reveal row upon row of crystalline teeth. In desperation, I lunged for the shortwave radio, the connection point, the doorway. I grabbed it and ran for the stairs, the entity flowing after me like living oil. I raced down the spiral staircase, through the living quarters, and out onto the rocky point where the lighthouse stood. The dawn sky was brightening, painting the clouds in pink and gold, a beautiful contrast to the horror pursuing me. I ran to the edge of the rocks, where they dropped steeply into the churning Atlantic. Behind me, the entity emerged from the lighthouse door, its form seeming to expand in the open air, reaching toward me with dozens of writhing appendages. I hurled the radio as far as I could into the sea. It hit the water with a distant splash and immediately sank. The entity paused, its form rippling with what might have been confusion or anger. Then it surged forward again, faster than before. I had nowhere left to run. The rocky point ended just feet behind me, with only the angry Atlantic below. The entity loomed before me, blocking any retreat to the lighthouse. As it reached for me, a massive wave rose from the sea below, not a natural wave, but a deliberate surge of water that shaped itself into a barrier between me and the entity. Within the wall of water, I could make out faces, dozens of them, the drowned men from all those lost ships. They were holding the entity back, containing it. I heard Gerald's voice, not in my ears but in my mind. "Run, Thomas. We can't hold it for long." I didn't question the impossible sight before me. I simply ran, ducking past the writhing mass of the entity where the watery barrier held it at bay. I sprinted for the lighthouse for safety. Behind me, I heard a sound like the ocean itself screaming in rage. I didn't look back until I'd reached the lighthouse door. When I did, I saw the entity being dragged backward toward the cliff edge, fighting against dozens of translucent hands that gripped its limbs. With a final, reality-shaking howl, it was pulled over the edge and into the waiting sea. The water seemed to boil for a moment, then settled into its normal rhythm of waves against rock. On the horizon, I thought I saw ships, ghostly vessels from different eras, sailing away from the shore. Among them, a merchant vessel that might have been the Windward. They faded as the sun rose higher, disappearing like mist in morning light. I've remained at Widow's Point Lighthouse. Some might think me mad for staying, but I understand now what this place is. A boundary, a thin spot between worlds, and every boundary needs a guardian. I've replaced the shortwave radio, but I keep it unplugged when not in use. Sometimes, in the deep night, I think I hear voices in the static of my clock radio, not threatening now, but watchful. Warnings, perhaps, or simply reminders that the boundary must be maintained. The third rule of lighthouse keeping, I've learned, is to respect what lies beyond the light's reach. The deep has its own rules, its own inhabitants. Some are malevolent, hungry for our fear and our souls. Others are protectors, the lost ones who have found purpose even in death. I keep the light burning, not just for ships passing in the night, but as a beacon against the darkness that waits in the deep. And sometimes, when fog shrouds the point and the boundary grows thin, I stand at the window and raise my hand in greeting to the ghostly ships that sail past, forever journeying, never arriving. They're out there still, caught between worlds. And thanks to them, I remain in this one.